11:58 p.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their antiseptic lullaby above the night shift hallway at Mercy General, and Brooke Sullivan moved through them like a ghost, a woman so unremarkable that most of the day staff couldn't have described her face 5 minutes after she clocked in. 3 years she'd been pushing 4 bags and emptying bedpans in these corridors, 3 years of keeping her head down, asking no questions, accepting every assignment without complaint. Her colleagues knew her as quiet, professional, forgettable. They didn't know that under her scrubs ran scars from shrapnel that had shredded her left forearm in Fallujah, or that her slight limp came from an IED blast that had killed everyone in the Humvee except her. They didn't know that every helicopter sound still sent her nervous system into high alert, that she'd chosen night shift specifically to avoid the daytime medevac landings that made her hands shake. In her locker, behind a purse she rarely opened, sat a pair of combat boots caked with desert sand, Salomon tactic boots, military tan, the kind that had marched through 3 separate wars. The only thing she'd kept from before. The only thing that proved her old life had been real. Dr. Sterling first noticed her during a morning round 3 months into her employment at Mercy General. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd done something right. She'd anticipated his needs before he voiced them, had the correct chart pulled before he asked for it, had already checked on his post-op patients and recorded their vitals with clinical precision. His pale grey eyes had narrowed slightly, the way a shark's eyes narrow when it tastes blood in the water. That kind of competence threatened his carefully constructed ecosystem. Staff who asked questions and followed protocols independently were hard to manage. Staff like Brooke, who seemed to understand exactly what he wanted and executed it without comment, were far more useful, as long as they stayed compliant. As long as they never stepped out of line. She'd chosen the night shift deliberately. Quieter. Fewer administrators. Fewer surgeons. Fewer opportunities to be noticed. The hospital became a different place after sunset, the hallways belonging to the overnight nurses and the emergency cases that nobody else wanted to handle. The antiseptic smell turned sharper under the fluorescent glow, less like a place of healing and more like a place where people were efficiently processed through a system. Brooke had learned to move through that system like water, present but weightless. She refilled saline bags in rooms where patients slept fitfully, updated charts at the nurse's station with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible. When other nurses made conversation, she gave brief answers. When they invited her to lunch, she brought her own meal to eat alone. When they gossiped about patients or doctors, she continued her work without comment. She'd been a weapon once. A surgical instrument. She'd performed emergency battlefield medicine on Marines whose names she'd never learned, kept them breathing under fire in the Sanjin Valley, held arterial pressures steady while IED shrapnel whistled overhead. She'd taken lives too, had held a rifle and made decisions in microseconds that meant men either came home to their families or didn't. That Brooke was gone. The Brooke who existed now was something quieter, something that resembled a normal person. Or at least could perform the convincing mimicry of one. The siren started at 11:03 p.m. 2 of them, wailing through the Houston heat like something was badly broken. Brooke was restocking the break room, replacing empty coffee cups in the cabinet, straightening the refrigerator's misaligned magnet, when the intercom crackled, trauma alert. Incoming by ambulance. Multiple GSWs from international incident. ETA for minutes. She paused for 1/10 of a second, her hand stilling on the cabinet door, then resumed moving. Not her problem yet. Not until he arrived. The emergency department exploded into motion. Trauma activations had a specific choreography, a practiced dance that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. But this one felt different. International incident meant complexity. Meant bureaucracy. Meant complications. 3 nurses raced past her toward the trauma bay, and Brooke finished straightening the cabinet, moved toward her assigned post at the ICU. Whatever was coming, it would end up on her unit. Dr. Sterling emerged from his office 15 minutes later, already in motion. His white coat hadn't a single wrinkle, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing every system in the hospital worked for him, not against him. The billing department, the insurance liaisons, the administration, they all understood their arrangement. Complex cases. Premium coverage. Careful documentation that maximized revenue while maintaining plausible deniability. He'd built a very profitable career on understanding exactly which patients could be billed aggressively and which ones might attract unwanted attention. He was already calculating as he walked, already pulling up the incoming patient's information on his tablet. Army Ranger Captain. Baghdad deployment. Shrapnel wounds to the left thoracic cage. Collapsed left lung. Massive lacerations to the anterior chest wall. Civilian transfer, which meant the military bureaucracy wouldn't be as intense as if he'd come through a military medical facility. Excellent. No JAG officers scrutinizing every procedure. No endless paperwork to the VA. Just a high-acuity patient with comprehensive military health insurance and no institutional oversight. The kind of case that paid very, very well. The ambulance doors burst through the ER entrance at 11:19 p.m., and the patient emerged on a stretcher, a man in his 30s, pale as death, blood already soaking through the field dressings. His left side was a map of trauma, and the paramedic riding alongside him was doing rescue breathing with a BVM, squeezing oxygen into lungs that weren't working right. The ER team took over with that choreographed precision, 6 hands moving at once, shouting vitals back and forth in their practiced shorthand. The patient was wheeled directly to the trauma bay, and Brooke watched from her position at the ICU desk, her face as still as water. She'd seen this before. Seen bodies arrive in pieces. Seen the organized chaos that emergency medicine created around catastrophe. Seen the way some people rose to meet it and others froze. Her hands didn't tremor. Her breathing didn't change. She watched, and she waited, and she already understood with absolute certainty that this man would be coming to her unit. Dr. Sterling appeared in the ICU doorway 10 minutes later, moving with purpose. Trauma activation in Bay 3, he announced to the assembled staff. Captain with penetrating thoracic trauma, multiple fragmentation wounds. He'll need ICU-level monitoring. Get the bed prepped, interventions likely. He was already mentally calculating the billing codes, the possible procedures, the length of stay that would maximize institutional reimbursement. A man could bleed out or a man could survive. Either way, Mercy General would be paid very handsomely for the attempt. The next voice belonged to the chief trauma surgeon, Dr. Hayes, and he sounded stressed over the ER intercom. We need a thoracic surgeon in Bay 3. Patient's O2 sat is dropping. Lung collapse progressing. ETA on surgery. Silence. 3 seconds of silence that meant everyone was checking their schedules. Then, not available. Call Dr. Martinez. More silence. Not available either. What about a longer silence, and then something in Hayes's tone shifted to resignation. 3 surgeons covering, all tied up with existing cases or on restrictions. Nobody's taking this. Brooke stood to gather supplies for the bed prep, her movements economical and precise. She was already thinking like a medic, already running through protocols, already understanding that this man was going to die unless someone intervened with surgical-level expertise. The ER team would stabilize him. The ICU would maintain him. But without someone willing to go into his chest and stop the bleeding, nobody was walking out of this alive. She was retrieving the monitor leads from the cabinet when the double doors from the ER corridor burst open and the stretcher came through, a sheet-covered mound of trauma surrounded by 6 people, hands moving in practiced patterns. The paramedic was still bagging, still pushing oxygen into lungs that refused to cooperate. The patient's left side was wrapped in field dressings, dark with blood that seemed to be everywhere, on his clothes, on the sheets, on the hands of the people keeping him alive. And then she saw his neck. A birthmark. Small, distinctive, shaped like a crescent moon. On the left side of his neck, just below the angle of the jaw. She'd seen that birthmark before. She'd seen it 20 years ago in the darkness of a burning Humvee in Baghdad, on the face of a terrified 7-year-old boy whose father was a translator for the Americans, whose family had died in an IED attack that wasn't supposed to happen, whose small hand had grabbed her collar as the heat and smoke closed in. She'd pulled him out. Had run into that burning vehicle with no thought for anything except that voice, that small, broken voice calling for help. Had carried him across her shoulders through the blast zone, through the secondary explosions, through 40 minutes of sniper fire that came from 3 directions simultaneously. Had kept him alive not through any special skill but through sheer stubborn refusal to let that small hand release her collar. And then the military had evacuated him. Family connection somewhere up the chain. He disappeared into the system, and she'd returned to her Humvee, and the war had continued, and that 7-year-old had become a ghost in her memory, just another life she'd touched and couldn't save. Except he was here. Now. 20 years later. A grown man. An Army Ranger. With a collapsing lung and nobody willing to fix him. Dr. Sterling appeared in the ICU, his expression already calculating. He looked at the patient, then at the chart, then at his tablet where the insurance information was already loading. Brooke watched his grey eyes move across the screen, and she understood exactly what he was thinking. Complex case. Good billing. No immediate family visible. Extensive interventions possible. The kind of patient who could generate $300,000 or $400,000 in legitimate revenue if handled with appropriate care. Get him stabilized, Sterling ordered, his tone clinical. Chest X-ray, CT angiography, full trauma panel. We'll need to see what we're dealing with before anyone commits to surgical intervention. The patient's chest rose and fell with the artificial rhythm of the BVM. His face was pale as paper. His eyes were closed, and Brooke couldn't tell if that was medication or unconsciousness. She moved toward the bed, her hands reaching for the monitor leads, her mind already running through protocols. His eyes were closed, and Brooke couldn't tell if that was medication or unconsciousness. She moved toward the bed, her hands reaching for the monitor leads, her mind already running through protocols. The chest tube was draining properly, pale fluid, good sign, but his oxygen saturation hovered at 88%, lower than it should be. She repositioned him gently, turned his body slightly left to ease the pressure on his damaged lung, and adjusted the flow meter from 4 liters to 6. His breathing deepened. The numbers climbed. 91%. 93%. Better. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway like a storm cloud taking human form. He wore a tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than Brooke's monthly rent, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his silver hair perfectly styled. Everything about him screamed money and power, which is exactly what made him dangerous at Mercy General, especially to a patient like the captain, whose insurance was about to be a very lucrative opportunity. Nurse Nobody, what exactly do you think you're doing making clinical decisions above your pay grade? Sterling's voice carried across the room with the precision of a blade, loud enough for the captain's sister to hear clearly from her chair in the corner, loud enough for the 2 orderlies in the hallway to pause. The sister's eyes widened. One of the orderlies pulled out a phone, already texting. Brooke recognized the cascade. In a hospital, information was currency, and Sterling had just made a deposit. Brooke kept her hand steady on the monitor. The patient's oxygen saturation was dropping to 88%, Doctor. I repositioned him per standard protocol for chest trauma. Her voice came out level, clinical, unremarkable. The voice of someone who belonged in the background, exactly where Sterling wanted her. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive, suffocating, and his eyes narrowed with the kind of contempt reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. Standard protocol is waiting for physician orders, not playing doctor because you watched some YouTube videos. This is a decorated officer, not one of your frequent flyer junkies. He turned toward the sister, letting his face soften into sympathy. I apologize for the confusion here. This nurse means well, but she sometimes forgets her limitations. The sister shifted uncomfortably, caught between gratitude for Sterling's apparent concern and discomfort at watching someone be humiliated in front of her. Her fingers twisted together in her lap. Brooke felt something move inside her chest, not fear, not anger, but the familiar sensation of watching a predator circle, testing for weakness. She'd learned this feeling long ago, in a desert with different uniforms and different stakes, but the principle remained unchanged: cowards always attacked when they had an audience. They needed witnesses to feel powerful. Without them, they were just men in expensive suits making fraudulent billing decisions. She took one measured breath. Felt a single tear escape, which she wiped away without breaking eye contact. Her jaw didn't clench. Her voice didn't waver. She said, "I've seen what cowards look like, doctor, and they always wear the cleanest uniforms." The room went silent. Brooke nodded once and walked past him toward the break room. The break room at Mercy General occupied a corner of the third floor with windows overlooking the parking lot and a vending machine that dispensed coffee that tasted like battery acid. At 2 a.m., during the quietest hours of the night shift, it was usually empty, a place where nurses could sit for their legally mandated 15-minute rest and pretend the world outside these walls didn't exist. Brooke sat at the corner table with her thermos of coffee and a sandwich she'd packed from home that morning. Turkey and mustard on wheat. Simple. Practical. Food was fuel, not comfort, a lesson that had stuck since her years in the field. Nurse Chen walked in first, took one look at Brooke, and grabbed her bag from the chair beside the refrigerator. She moved to the opposite side of the room, suddenly very focused on her phone, her shoulders angled away. Two respiratory therapists who'd been laughing about something, probably the new electronic charting system, went silent. They collected their phones and their dignity and left through separate doors without a word. Marcus, the unit clerk who usually shared conspiracy theories about hospital administration with anyone who'd listen, suddenly remembered he needed to check something at the nurse's station. The urgency in his movement suggested it was genuinely important, the kind of important that couldn't wait even one more second. The break room felt smaller after they left. The vending machine hummed its mechanical rhythm, a sound like an old engine struggling to turn over. Brooke took one bite of her sandwich, then set it down. Her appetite had disappeared somewhere between the captain's room and the moment Sterling smiled at her with contempt in his eyes. She sat alone under the flickering fluorescent lights, listening to the silence, and understood what was happening. This was how they worked, not with grand gestures, but with small withdrawals of basic human acknowledgement. A nurse who was avoided became a nurse who was isolated. An isolated nurse became easy to eliminate. Sterling was playing a game he'd clearly played before, and he was very good at it. By morning shift change, Brooke's name appeared on the unit disciplinary board in the main hallway, written in red marker as if the color itself could amplify the shame: RN Sullivan, written warning, unauthorized patient advocacy and insubordination to attending physician, under review for protocol violations. The words hung there like an accusation, and every nurse who walked past read them. Brooke watched the scene from the nurse's station, observed the whispers that rippled through the group, saw the way people's eyes flickered toward her before quickly looking away. The gossip created a hum of judgment that followed her through her remaining rounds, rooms where colleagues suddenly became very focused on their charts when she entered, where conversation stopped mid-sentence and restarted only after she'd passed. She moved between patients like a ghost, efficient and invisible, which was exactly what she'd been trying to achieve for 3 years. It was easier to disappear when nobody looked at you. Easier to survive when nobody cared enough to ask questions. Brooke returned to the captain's room at 6 a.m. for her final rounds before shift change. Dr. Sterling stood beside the bed reviewing billing codes on his tablet, his fingers swiping with the rhythm of someone calculating something worth calculating. Behind him, the monitor showed the captain's heart rate climbing, 95 beats per minute, then 102, while his blood pressure drifted downward. The numbers were moving in the wrong direction, a slow waltz toward catastrophe. His heart rate is climbing and blood pressure dropping, Brooke said from the doorway, not crossing the threshold fully. He needs a cardiac ultrasound. Sterling waved his hand without looking up. I'll decide what he needs. Your job is to document and follow orders, nurse nobody. The nickname landed exactly where he intended it to, a small knife disguised as a comment. The captain's sister had left 15 minutes ago to get coffee from the lobby, her vigil temporarily abandoned. Brooke seized the moment and moved to the bedside, her fingers finding his pulse, weak, thready, like a bird's heartbeat, fast and fragile. She placed her hand on his neck and felt the jugular veins distending, the skin stretched tight as drums. She'd felt this before, in a field hospital in Fallujah, in a Humvee rolling toward an extraction point, in moments when the body spoke in a language everyone understood, pressure building, something compressing, time running shorter. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardium. The heart suffocating inside its own membrane. Sterling made 3 phone calls while still standing in the captain's room, each one code language Brooke had learned to recognize over her 3 years of watching fraud unfold in real time. Yes, we can justify the extended ICU stay. The family has premium federal insurance through his military benefits. I'll add the consultation codes for the cardiologist, even if we don't actually need him. He hung up and glanced at her. Don't you have other patients, Sullivan? She did, for others scattered across the unit, but every instinct honed across 12 years, 3 tours, and 2 Purple Hearts told her the captain was running out of time. She excused herself and completed her rounds mechanically, her mind already somewhere else, her hands moving through the motions while her eyes kept returning to the monitor screens, watching for the cascade that would come when the pressure in his chest became too much for his heart to bear. At 1 p.m., Dr. Sterling called a meeting. Brooke was summoned to a small office where the nursing supervisor sat behind a desk she didn't own, with Sterling standing beside her like a creditor. The supervisor's name was Patricia, and she'd made her career by agreeing with whoever held the most institutional power. Today, that was Sterling. Nurse Sullivan has demonstrated a pattern of overstepping her scope of practice, Sterling said, his voice all concern and professionalism now, the perfect performance of a man who'd never humiliated anyone in his life. She's emotionally invested in this patient for reasons I can't determine, and it's clouding her judgment. I'm recommending immediate reassignment from this case. Patricia nodded, already reaching for her clipboard. Brooke, you're being moved to the pediatric wing effective immediately. Sharon will take over Captain Reeves' care. Sharon was competent but had never handled trauma, had never worked in a burn unit, had never learned to read the signs that separated a patient who was stable from a patient who was dropping toward death in slow motion. Brooke kept her voice level because that was what competence required. Sharon doesn't have trauma experience. If his condition deteriorates. That's exactly the kind of overstepping we're talking about, Sterling interrupted smoothly. You're reassigned, effective immediately. Pack your things. Brooke walked to her locker in the break room where nobody looked up as she approached. The worn combat boots sat at the bottom, still in their original state, laces frayed, leather creased from 1,000 miles of terrain that no civilian would ever understand. She placed her hand on them and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since Baghdad, a small request to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Then she violated a direct order and returned to the captain's room. The captain's room at 6 a.m. held the particular kind of silence that came before bad things happened. Brooke stood in the doorway, watching Dr. Sterling tap his tablet with the deliberate slowness of a man who understood that documentation was insurance. The monitor behind the bed painted a story in green lines, heart rate 128, climbing. Blood pressure 94/58, sliding downward. The arterial line showed a narrowing pulse pressure, the top and bottom numbers growing closer together like a fist tightening around the patient's chest. Sterling didn't look up. His tablet glowed in the pre-dawn darkness, a rectangle of light illuminating his profile as he scrolled through billing codes. 14,000 for the initial OR time. 2,300 for the trauma imaging. He was cataloging a man suffering like inventory at a warehouse. The vitals are deteriorating, Brooke said. It wasn't a question. The numbers didn't require interpretation, they required action. Sterling finally turned. His eyes moved across the monitor without urgency, without concern. A surgeon looking at his own quarterly profit margin would have shown more emotion. Post-operative decline is expected in complex trauma cases, Ms. Sullivan. It indicates nothing urgent. His heart rate is elevated. Blood pressure's dropping. The pulse pressure is narrowing. She kept her voice level, clinical. Not a suggestion. Not a request. The kind of voice that came from 18 years of briefing officers in operations centers, from standing in sandstorms giving orders that meant people would come home or they wouldn't. The kind of voice she'd buried under 3 years of "yes, doctor, and I'll make a note of that." Sterling's jaw tightened. He could hear the shift in her tone, not quite insubordination, but not quite compliance either. A line being drawn. Document the decline as expected post-operative trajectory. I'll review him on my morning rounds. His morning rounds meant 10 a.m. At the current rate of deterioration, there wouldn't be a patient left to round on by then. Brooke didn't argue. She'd learned that lesson already. Instead, she went to the bedside computer and began typing exactly what Sterling had ordered: patient presenting with expected post-operative decline. Vitals consistent with normal post-surgical response. No acute intervention required. Each word was a small lie, stacked on top of the last one until the page looked like a structure built from sand. She hit save. The hospital's electronic health record swallowed her documentation, filed it away where it could be cited later by lawyers and insurance companies as evidence that nobody saw this coming. But Brooke saw it. She saw the distended jugular veins. She saw the way the patient's oxygen saturation had started creeping downward despite the high-flow oxygen. She saw the clinical picture assembling itself like a nightmare made of physiology: blood filling the pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the heart growing tighter and tighter with each beat, pressure building until the heart couldn't fill anymore. Cardiac tamponade. The most urgent surgical emergency. The one nobody would touch. By 10 p.m., Brooke was sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, technically off duty but unable to leave. Her shift had ended 4 hours ago. She'd clocked out, changed out of her scrubs, walked to the parking garage, but her feet had carried her only as far as her Honda before she stopped and just sat there, engine running, the air conditioning blowing stale recycled air across her face. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. The respiratory therapist who owed her a favor from a night 6 months ago when she'd covered his call while his daughter was in the emergency room. He was texting updates from inside the hospital, punching them out with his thumbs while he should have been doing other things. 11 p.m. HR 132. BP 92/60. Dropping. Brooke stared at the number. 92 systolic. That was the sound of a heart struggling against increasing pressure, trying to eject blood into vessels where the sac around it was turning into a vice. Her phone buzzed again. Sterling told Sharon not to call anyone. Said it's normal decline. She's scared. Sharon. The night shift charge nurse who'd watched Brooke get publicly humiliated 2 days ago and had done nothing. Sharon who'd chosen her position over a colleague. But even Sharon had a limit to what she'd accept. Even Sharon could see when a patient was dying. Thunder rolled across Houston in the distance, a low percussion that rattled the car windows. Rain was coming. Brooke could smell it on the wind, the particular weight of humidity that meant the sky was about to open. At 10:08 p.m., an email notification lit up her personal phone. Subject line: Inquiry regarding nursing credentials. The State Nursing Board had received an inquiry about her background, her certifications, her handling of patients. The inquiry didn't identify its source, but Brooke knew. Sterling had activated his network. The way some men made phone calls to get things done, the hospital lawyer calling the state board, casually mentioning that there was a nurse at Mercy General who might be practicing outside her scope, that there had been some concerns about patient advocacy overstepping protocols, that it might be worth a formal review. She'd buried herself so carefully. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of accepting every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being treated like she was something less than the doctors around her. All of it was supposed to be insurance. If you kept your head down, kept your mouth shut, did your job and nothing more, nobody dug. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked at the combat boot sitting in a locker with a military unit patch still sewn into the inner lining. At 11:02 p.m., a call came through from a blocked number. Her heart did something irregular when she saw it, the kind of flutter that came from instinct, from survival training, from knowing that blocked numbers in the middle of the night meant consequences. She answered. Is this Brooke Sullivan, formerly of Naval Special Warfare Group? A woman's voice. Professional. Government-grade bureaucracy underneath the politeness. Brooke's hands went numb. Formally. As if her service record was ancient history. As if 20 years counted as former. She hung up without answering, her breath coming in short controlled pulls. Sterling wasn't just attacking her credentials. He was digging. He'd hired investigators or called in favors from someone who knew how to access the parts of her past that were supposed to stay sealed. Classified. Buried. At 11:15 p.m., Marcus sent another text, his crashing. Sharon called for Sterling but he's not answering. She doesn't know what to do. BP 78 50 seconds. 78/52. That wasn't blood pressure anymore. That was a warning siren in the shape of numbers. That was a body trying to compensate for volume loss, for fluid where there shouldn't be any, for a heart being squeezed by something it couldn't fight. Brooke didn't think. She didn't calculate risk or consider consequences or weigh the fact that she was about to walk back into a situation that could finish what Sterling had already started. She grabbed her badge from the passenger seat and ran toward the hospital entrance, taking the stairs 3 at a time because the elevator would require her to wait, and there was no time for waiting anymore. The emergency stairwell echoed with each footfall, a rhythm like gunfire, like running through a compound where every second meant the difference between extraction and casualty. Her legs found their old pace, the one they remembered from before, the one that had carried her toward burning buildings and across rooftops and through territory where the ground beneath you could give way at any moment. The fourth-floor corridor was quiet except for the sound of the ventilator in room 408. Brooke moved toward it with the terrible clarity that came from recognizing a moment. This was the hinge. This was the place where something changed forever. She could still turn around. She could still walk away and protect the life she'd built, the careful anonymity, the invisible existence. But she was already opening the door. Sharon was frozen beside the bed, her hand hovering over the phone like a bird that couldn't land. The monitor was alarming, that distinctive rhythm of distress, the audio equivalent of a building collapsing. The captain's lips had taken on a bluish tint. His neck veins bulged like they were about to rupture. His jugular veins are distended, Brooke said, the clinical voice returning because it was easier than being human right now. Heart sounds are muffled. The pericardium is full. We need a surgeon now. Sharon made the first call to the on-call surgeon. Complications. Unavailable. The second call met the same response, liability concerns, previous scheduling conflicts, a sudden unavoidable emergency elsewhere in the hospital. The third call, the attending cardiologist, who listened and said that without Dr. Sterling's explicit orders, he couldn't authorize any intervention. The fourth call brought the same answer in different words. Brooke looked at the equipment cart. At the ultrasound machine in the corner, a device that could show exactly what the clinical picture already told her, fluid around the heart, chambers compressed, the architecture of dying rendered in grayscale. At her hands, which had performed this procedure once in her actual life, in a sandstorm outside Fallujah with nothing but a field kit and muscle memory and the knowledge that the alternative to trying was a body bag. How long? Sharon asked. Not a question about prognosis. A question about time. 10 minutes, Brooke said. Maybe less. And then something shifted in the room. Not the monitors. Not the patient. Something in Brooke herself. The careful nurse disappeared. The compliant employee evaporated like morning dew. What remained was something that had been waiting in the dark for 3 years, waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for a choice between the life she'd built and the person she actually was. She moved toward the equipment cart with the terrifying fluid precision that came from 18 years of training, not hesitation, not doubt, just the body remembering what the mind had tried to forget. The monitor shrieked at 2 a.m. One long continuous alarm that meant the captain's blood pressure had collapsed 20 points in 90 seconds. Brooke was already moving before Sharon's voice came over the intercom. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. No. The captain's room. ICU. She moved through the hospital corridors like muscle memory made flesh. 3 years of burying herself, of quiet shifts and invisible hands, and her body remembered exactly how to run toward the sound of dying. The captain lay rigid on the bed, his oxygen saturation dropping, his skin the color of wet concrete. Cardiac tamponade. His own heart was drowning him in blood. Brooke's hands didn't shake. They never did. Not when it mattered. She positioned the ultrasound probe below his sternum and the screen bloomed with the answer. A crescent moon of dark fluid surrounding the heart itself. 120 milliliters of blood that had nowhere to go, crushing the ventricle like a fist closing around a bird. She could see it in real time, the fluid pressing inward, the heart's chambers collapsing with each weakening beat. His blood pressure was 68/40. At this rate, he had 6 minutes before total cardiac arrest. "Sharon, call his sister back," Brooke said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Steady. Certain. The voice of someone who'd made these decisions before, who'd lived through worse than this sterile hospital night. She opened the pericardiocentesis kit with movements that belonged to someone else. Someone younger. Someone in sand-colored uniform in a place that still felt like it was burning. Alcohol swab. Gauze. The long 18-gauge needle that would go through muscle and ribs and fat and finally into the sack of fluid that was suffocating his heart. "If I do this without a physician present, I lose my license," Brooke said aloud. Speaking to the room. Speaking to the captain's sleeping face. Speaking to the memory of a husband who told her never to do this again, never to pick up that weight, never to be guardian angel anymore. "But if I don't, he dies in 6 minutes. The needle pierced the skin with a soft hiss. She guided it forward using the ultrasound as her eyes, watching the needle tip approach the pericardial space with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness under fire with mortars walking closer. 1 centimeter. 2. The sensation of breaking through the membrane. The sudden dark flow of blood into the syringe as pressure released from the captain's heart. 120 milliliters. 200. 230. His blood pressure climbed. 72, 78. 85, oxygen saturation rising. Color returning to his face like the sun coming back to the world. It was 11:08 p.m. when his heart finally beat at a normal rhythm again. When the monitor showed a pattern that meant survival instead of statistics. Brooke stayed beside him for the next 16 hours. The rest of the night staff attempted to relieve her. "You need sleep," Sharon said at 3 a.m. Brooke didn't answer. At 5 a.m., one of the younger nurses offered to take a turn. Brooke shook her head once, kept her hand on the captain's wrist, feeling his pulse climb and fall beneath her fingers. She'd held dying men before. She knew the difference between a pulse that strengthened and one that was just echoing itself toward silence. This one was getting stronger. Every 30 minutes she reassessed. Every hour she documented. Every 2 hours the fluid tried to reaccumulate and she drew it out again, her hands moving with the certainty of someone whose body had absorbed lessons in trauma medicine that no hospital could teach. The fluorescent lights above hummed their endless drone. Rain hammered the window in waves, each gust making the glass shudder. The ICU monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator whispered. These were the sounds of survival. At 6 a.m., Dr. Sterling arrived. He stood in the doorway of the captain's room for exactly 3 seconds before his face went white. Not the white of relief. The white of a man watching his calculated future collapse in real time. He saw the pericardiocentesis needle still positioned at the sternum. He saw the fluid bags hanging beside the bed. He saw Brooke's hands, which had just finished recording vital signs in a log that documented every milliliter drawn, every medication pushed, every decision made without his signature. His eyes met hers and something flickered across his expression. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that whatever he thought Brooke Sullivan was, she was something else entirely. He turned and walked to the nurse's station. From the captain's room, Brooke watched him make phone calls. 6 of them, over the course of 20 minutes. His voice never rose. He smiled at people passing in the hallway. He looked like a man conducting routine business, and that was the most terrifying thing about him. He was competent. He was networked. And he was very, very afraid. By 8 a.m., 2 hospital security officers appeared at her side. "Ms. Sullivan, you're being placed on immediate suspension pending investigation into unauthorized medical procedures. Please surrender your badge and leave the premises." The words came out rehearsed, as if security had been given a script ahead of time. The captain's sister stood up from the bedside chair, her face shock and rage. "She saved his life. She worked all night. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his face arranged in an expression of profound sadness. "I understand this is difficult," he said to the gathering crowd that had begun forming in the hallway. News traveled fast in a hospital. Word had already spread that something had happened in the ICU. But protocol exists for patient safety. We have to investigate. He looked at Brooke with something like sympathy, and that's when she understood. He wasn't trying to destroy her out of anger. He was doing it out of calculation. She was a loose thread. Pull it and his entire billing operation would unravel. Brooke unclipped her badge from her lanyard. The plastic felt heavier than it should have. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of pushing the ghosts away. 3 years of pretending that Brooke Sullivan was just a quiet night nurse with steady hands and no history. She set the badge on the nurse's station counter. The plastic clicked against the laminate and the sound echoed down the hallway. Every nurse who'd left the break room when she sat down. Every respiratory therapist who'd treated her like she was contagious. Every tech who'd looked through her instead of at her. They all stood silent as she walked past them toward the elevator. From her locker, she retrieved her purse and a cardboard box containing one item, a pair of worn combat boots, tan leather creased with the shape of 20 years. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't say goodbye. The elevator doors closed and she descended in silence, down through the levels of the hospital where people were being born and dying and recovering from surgery that Dr. Sterling had billed as necessary when it was merely profitable. The rain in the parking lot hit her face like a slap. 3 days later, she knelt in the mud at her husband's grave. The headstone read Lieutenant Commander James Sullivan, SEAL Team 3, killed in action Kandahar, and beside it was another marker, smaller and older, for the daughter they'd lost to complications at birth, buried next to him because they belonged together in death the way they'd been separated in life. "I tried to disappear like you wanted," Brooke whispered. Her jeans were soaked through. Rain plastered her hair to her face and ran in streams down her neck. "I tried to be normal. To heal. To forget the sound of your voice on that last radio call when the building went down and you said you were going back for the interpreter's son." She pressed her forehead against the wet marble. "But I failed again. I couldn't just watch him die." The cardboard box containing her combat boots sat beside her in the mud. In it was also the paper, the separation agreement, the psychiatric evaluation that said she was unfit for active duty. The letter from command that said her records would be sealed, her location protected, her identity buried so deep that nobody at Mercy General could ever connect the quiet night nurse to Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, code name Guardian Angel, the first woman to complete advanced tactical medicine under fire. The sound came first. A low thump in the sky, growing louder, cutting through the rain with the unmistakable rhythm of a Black Hawk helicopter. Rotor blades tearing the air into pieces. The sound of military power, of command structure, of a world she'd left behind. It landed in the cemetery parking lot, the skids touching down on asphalt, the rotors still spinning. 2 Navy officers in dress uniforms walked directly toward her through the rows of headstones, their covers tucked under their arms in respect for the dead. Brooke didn't stand. She knelt there, watching them approach, knowing exactly what this meant. Knowing that the threads couldn't stay buried forever. Knowing that when you saved someone's life twice, the universe collected its debt in different ways. One of the officers extended his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet with the grip of someone accustomed to moving people who didn't want to move. "Senior Chief Sullivan," he said. Not a question. A confirmation. We need to talk about why your name just appeared in a federal investigation. The rotor wash shook the entire hospital. Windows rattled. Coffee cups slid across desks. Nobody at Mercy General had ever seen a Black Hawk land on the roof before, not in the daylight, not announced, not with the kind of authority that made administrators suddenly very interested in their own job security. 2 Navy officers in dress uniforms walked into the administration office at 2:53 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the way they moved suggested this wasn't a request. It was a command. The hospital CEO looked up from his desk. One officer, a commander with silver dolphins on his chest, spoke in a voice like a tank idling in a garage. "We need to speak with Senior Chief Sullivan. Immediately. This is not optional." Dr. Sterling, who'd been reviewing discharge paperwork 3 offices down, heard that voice carry through the hallway. He heard the word Senior Chief. He heard his own blood pressure start climbing. He'd spent the last 72 hours convinced he'd won. The FBI investigation into his billing practices wouldn't escalate because he had board members protecting him. Brooke Sullivan's suspension was permanent. She was already broken, already isolated, already gone. But you don't hear Black Hawks land on civilian hospital roofs for just anyone. You don't see Navy officers move with that particular brand of controlled violence for ordinary personnel disputes. Sterling walked slowly toward the administration office, and for the first time in 3 days, the confidence left his posture like air escaping a punctured lung. The captain was awake. Conscious. Strong enough to be sitting up in a wheelchair that security had rolled into the lobby, his fur still running, his chest bandaged where Brooke's hands had saved his life 16 hours straight, his eyes tracking the Navy officers with the recognition of someone who'd spent 20 years around men like them. When Sterling entered the administration office, the captain's jaw tightened. He looked directly at the Navy commander. "That's her," he said. "That's Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. She saved my life twice." His voice was still rough from the intubation tube, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Once in Baghdad when I was 7 years old. And 3 days ago when everyone else gave up." The captain extended his hand toward the officers. "Whatever you came here for, she's the one you want." The hospital administrator's hands trembled as she opened Brooke's personnel file. She'd been handed it by security 40 minutes ago with a single instruction: have this ready. Now. The file was thin. 3 years of employment records. Shift schedules. Commendations for patient care. Disciplinary actions, including the one Sterling had personally filed, dated just 48 hours ago. The administrator's eyes widened as she kept reading. She looked up at the Navy officers, then back at the document, then at Sterling, whose face had gone the color of wet concrete. Her service record, the administrator whispered, more to herself than anyone else. It's sealed. Naval Intelligence Classified. She paused, reading slowly now. Navy Cross. Combat Valor. Fallujah. 2 Silver Stars. Purple Heart. And she's listed as the first woman to complete Advanced Tactical Medicine Under Fire certification. The administrator's voice cracked. She's the first woman ever. The SEAL team leader, a master chief with a presence that made the air pressure change, with eyes that had seen things that left permanent scars, stepped forward. He unfolded a single piece of paper with an official Department of Defense letterhead. His voice was measured. Precise. Each word placed like a surgeon placing sutures. Bronze Star for meritorious service. He looked up. Sterling wasn't breathing. Silver Star for gallantry in action. Second Silver Star. Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat. The silence in the room was so thick you could operate in it. And a Navy Cross. That's the 3rd highest decoration we award. That means she did something that changed the outcome of an entire operation. The Master Chief's eyes moved to Sterling. She's being recalled for a classified medical rescue operation in Kandahar. Direct orders from NAVSPECWAR Command. She leaves in 6 hours. The door opened. 2 FBI agents. Then 2 more. One of them, a woman with a badge that read Special Agent Chen, walked directly to Dr. Sterling. She held up a piece of paper. "Dr. Richard Sterling, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The words wouldn't form. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one," the other agents were already moving past him, entering his office, carrying out boxes. Boxes filled with patient files. Billing records. Communication logs showing every phone call he'd made to board members, every favor he'd called in, every contact he'd weaponized to destroy a nurse he'd never understood. Agent Chen continued reading the rights as she escorted him out of the administration office. "We've been investigating your billing practices for 4 months. You've defrauded the Veterans Affairs system of approximately $847,000. You billed for phantom procedures, inflated equipment charges, and documented procedures never performed on active duty personnel." She paused. "But what's really going to be a problem for you is that your attempt to forge Senior Chief Sullivan's employment records left a digital trail. A very clear digital trail." Security officers moved Sterling through the hospital hallway like escorts removing refuse. The handcuffs made soft metallic sounds against his sides. His pristine white coat, the symbol of authority he'd worn like a weapon, was already gone, confiscated by administration, hung up in some HR closet where it would sit until they disposed of it. The nurses on the day shift stood frozen at their stations. The ones who'd ignored Brooke's lunch requests. The ones who'd crossed the break room when she entered. The ones who'd participated in the slow, methodical social destruction of a woman they'd never bothered to know. They watched as the doctor who'd orchestrated that campaign walked past them in handcuffs. One nurse, Marcus's colleague Jennifer, pulled out her phone and recorded. Others did the same. Sterling's wife appeared in the lobby, called by administration, and the expression on her face suggested she'd known. Not the details, but the shape of the truth. The kind of ugly truth you can feel in a marriage long before anyone speaks it aloud. The captain's sister found Marcus at the nurse's station. He was holding a piece of paper. A forwarding address. A phone number. Instructions for how to reach Senior Chief Sullivan if she made contact. The sister's eyes were wet. "Where is she? Where's Nurse Sullivan?" Marcus hesitated. The instructions in his hands were clear about operational security. About not discussing personnel movements. About the classified nature of her assignment. But this was the sister of the man Brooke had just spent 72 hours saving. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "But the Navy officers who came for her, they left in a helicopter toward the west side of the city. She's already gone." The sister nodded. She pulled out her phone and texted the captain's room. 5 seconds later, the captain's phone buzzed. He read the message from his sister. "I found her. Tell her I said thank you. Tell her my brother gets to live because she refused to let him die." The SEAL team leader stood in the hospital lobby at 3:22 p.m. and made one secure phone call. Radio encryption. Classified line. The kind of communication that went through scrambled military networks designed to resist foreign intelligence collection. He spoke exactly one sentence: "Guardian Angel, you're being recalled for classified medical rescue operation in Kandahar. We need you. Wheels up in 6 hours." 20 miles away, in the rain, Brooke knelt at her husband's grave. She'd come here the night she was suspended, the night she'd thought her life was ending. She'd come here to apologize to the man she'd married, to confess that she'd tried to disappear like he'd wanted, tried to be normal, tried to be just a nurse. And failed. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She didn't look at it immediately. She pressed her palm flat against the wet grass above his grave and whispered 3 words, "I'm going back." Then she read the message. Navspecwa Command. Classified assignment. Kandahar. She smiled, the first real smile in 72 hours, and she understood finally what her late husband had tried to teach her for 8 years: you can't bury who you are. You can only pretend long enough to forget. And forgetting doesn't save lives. Only truth saves lives. 2 years later, a documentary filmmaker arrived at a community college on the east side of Houston to shoot a segment about healthcare fraud in the American medical system. She found Dr. Richard Sterling in a brightly lit classroom, teaching CPR certification to a group of 14 students. He wore khaki pants and a polo shirt with a community college logo. No white coat. No stethoscope. No authority. His name tag read, Instructor Sterling, with no credentials listed. He demonstrated chest compressions on a CPR dummy with the mechanical precision of a man who'd repeated the same motion so many times that his hands no longer required conscious instruction. His face was neutral. Blank. The kind of face that belongs to someone who's learned to exist without expectation. One student asked him why he taught CPR. Sterling paused. "Because I made mistakes," he said quietly. "And this is my way of trying to help people I can't hurt anymore." The documentary filmmaker moved on. She wasn't interested in his rehabilitation narrative. She was interested in how many patients he'd defrauded. How many insurance companies he'd stolen from. How many lives he'd damaged in pursuit of wealth he didn't even need. Across Houston, in a training facility at the Houston Veterans Affairs Hospital, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan stood in front of 40 combat medics in full military dress uniform. Blue and gold. Service ribbons running down her chest like a history of sacrifice written in color. Her name tag read Sullivan, B., Senior Chief, Naval Special Warfare Command. Behind her, on the wall, hung a glass case. Inside the case were her old combat boots, scuffed, worn, the leather cracked from desert heat and decades of use. Next to the boots sat 2 photographs. The first showed a terrified 7-year-old boy being pulled from a burning Humvee in Fallujah, smoke billowing, fire in the background. The second showed Army Ranger Captain David Reeves in dress uniform, pinning a civilian service medal on Brooke's chest. The plaque read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Navy Cross, Fallujah 2004. Silver Star, Operation Desert Clarity 2007. Second Silver Star, Operation Nightfall 2009. First woman to achieve Advanced Tactical Medicine Under Fire certification. Dedicated to those who answered the call twice. She taught a procedure on cardiac tamponade. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, exact, efficient, practiced. She narrated every step. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. You're looking for immediate blood return to confirm the diagnosis. Hiss of air escaping. That's your sign you've decompressed the tension. Then you decide if you need pericardiocentesis or if emergency surgery is available. A young Army medic raised his hand. Senior Chief, what if you're alone? What if there's no backup? Brooke paused. She looked at the medic directly. Then you become the backup someone else needs. That's what you signed up for. That's what every person in this room volunteered to do. She walked to the window. Rain hammered the glass. 16 hours I stayed at the bedside of my patient. 16 hours. There were times I wanted to walk away. There were times I thought I couldn't. But quitting wasn't an option. Not then. Not now. Not ever. The final scene showed Brooke walking through the hallway of the VA hospital in her dress uniform. Veterans in wheelchairs nodded as she passed. They recognized her. They'd seen her name. They understood what her boots in that case meant. What her medals meant. What her presence meant. She moved like someone who'd finally stopped running. Like someone who'd finally accepted that the warrior she'd tried to bury was the healer she'd become. The camera pulled back. The hallway filled with images of heroes on the wall, service members who'd given their lives, who'd changed the outcome of operations, who'd saved others at terrible personal cost. And now Brooke's photograph hung among them. Not hidden. Not erased. Just there. Permanent. Honest. The final words appeared on screen. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you found Brooke's story as powerful as we did, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story of hidden heroism. Drop a comment telling us, if you had been in Brooke's position, would you have stayed 16 hours? What would you have done? And share this video with anyone you know who deserves to hear that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. Thank you for watching.